Okay, so that's Saren Sensei. She has a YouTube channel, and that was trending on Twitter all weekend long. People had a lot to say about that, so let's talk about it. Susan Goldberg is back with me. She's from the National Geographic. Tim Wise is the author of Colorblind. He's with me. And Rashad Robinson is the executive director of colorofchange.org. Welcome to all of you. Rashad, lucky you. You get the first question. Does Bruno Mars deserve that?
You know, I don't actually know that if Bruno Mars directly deserves that, but the larger question is about the long history of black art, black culture being stolen and sold in the marketplace, and black people not receiving the same credit. Even from the history of Elvis Presley to Iggy Azalea and other performers now, to even movies, big Hollywood movies that are made about jazz that include no black people. The larger question I think that we have to wrestle with in this conversation about cultural appropriation is, how do we change the rules in Hollywood and throughout many industries that continue to love black culture but hate black people, and in return black people never get the benefit or the resources that they should for the beauty and the art that they've given to this country.
I do understand that, but going back to Bruno Mars for just a second, Tim, is he a karaoke singer?
I mean,
he's
I'm not a music
Puerto Rican, right? He has a mixed ethnic background.
He's a person of color, so whether or not there's cultural appropriation based on whether he is black is a question I think black folks will ultimately have to decide. It's not for me as a white person to criticize him for appropriating someone else's culture, if indeed that's what he's doing. What I would say is very much like what Rashad said, and that is that the issue is, number one, why do certain people's art get used by others and not credited, and how do we change the rules? To me, the issue of cultural appropriation is tricky because to some extent art is derivative, and most art is appropriative of something. Everything builds on other things. The question for me has always been for artists, and usually it's white artists who are accused of appropriation as opposed to people of color appropriating other people of color. In this particular instance, I think the issue is, does an artist pay significant homage and recognize the roots of their art? I think if people do that, they are usually accepted, even if they are somewhat appropriative. It's why Eminem is accepted within the world of hip-hop, because he has always been, even though he's making an art form that is black art, he's very clear about that. A lot of other white folks in hip-hop haven't been nearly as clear. Same thing with rock and roll. The Rolling Stones are very clear that they are ultimately blues musicians, and that they pay tribute in interviews and books, they always did, to the black artists from whom they learned. So as a result, you don't hear the kinds of criticisms, let's say, of them that you would other rock and roll bands that maybe don't acknowledge that. So I think it's about acknowledging the source of your musical wisdom. Right. If you do that, I think you'll be accepted. If you don't, then the charge of appropriation is probably okay.
So I will say that Bruno Mars fans are not happy with Saren Sensei. This is just one tweet answering to her charges. This is from Sean King. I just want to be practical here. Are people saying that Bruno Mars shouldn't sing, or that when he sings he needs to somehow whiten that up and sound more like Rod Stewart? I'm dead serious. What type of music is this man allowed to do? Right. So Susan, I'll post that question to you. You know, I just took that DNA test and I found out I have all kinds of stuff in my background. So do I now have the right to take bits of that culture and add it to my repertoire?
Well, I'm glad you asked me that rather than about Bruno Mars' music, because I'm a poor excuse for a music critic. But you know, in our magazine in April, in our issue about race, we had 6 people take our DNA test, and they have about, you know, a third Northern European and a third African, and, you know, a third something else. They all had the exact same profiles, and yet they present completely different from each other. One says she's black, one says she's white, somebody else says I'm mixed race, and they all define differently. So I think as people start finding out, as you did, more and more about your cultures, people might start thinking differently about what they can do and what they can't do.
Right, and then there's the extreme examples, and I'm not saying in any way this example is right or moral or ethical, but here goes. Rachel Dolezal, we all remember her. She was a civil rights leader and she pretended to be African American. So Netflix has this new documentary out, and people are not very happy about that. But I just want to play a bit of that just to show people what I'm talking about. Here it is.
when something gets destroyed, you have to rebuild it. You can't just pretend that it didn't happen and everything gets fixed.
Why does the documentary have to happen then, Mom? Why
It's
couldn't
called
you just done the
rebuilding.
book?
It's called rebuilding.
This is gonna
Some
affect
people
more
read.
than just your life.
Some people read, and yeah, what happened affected more than just my life. If somebody has hope, don't take that away from them, because maybe that's all they have.
So, Rashad, I don't know. I have mixed feelings. Actually, I don't. It's like, why did Netflix make a documentary on that woman?
I know. In 2018, I was really hoping that I wouldn't have to talk about Rachel Dolezal anymore. But what I will say is, first of all, this is an example of whose stories get to be told and whose stories don't get to be told. And the idea that if Rachel Dolezal really feels so connected with black folks, that she feels that she somehow is black, the idea that she would sit there on this screen and cause such damage to this black child. I watched the full clip, and as I watched it, I just cringed, as this child did not want Rachel to continue on with this narrative. And it's always been about Rachel, and it's always been about her, and never about black people or black culture. And if she cared so much about black people, she would know why this is so frustrating, annoying, and ridiculous for so many of us. And we would just hope that she kind of goes away.
Tim, you know, I just have to wonder why we're still talking about these issues. Like, why is it still so confusing when it comes to race issues in America?
Well, that's the real issue. The reason we're still talking is because we haven't had really honest discussions about the legacy of racism and white supremacy in this country and what it's done in terms of where people live, where they go to school, the wealth disparities, now 15-to-1 white families on average versus black families, 12-to-1 white to Latinx families. And so until we have real conversations about how we got in this predicament, we're going to continue to have these somewhat surface conversations like the ones in that, you know, quote unquote documentary, or that thing that they're doing with Rachel Dolezal. Ultimately, until we get down to the reality of our history and how that history continues to affect us in everything from criminal justice to healthcare to education to the job market, then we're going to end up continuing these pedantic discussions instead. And I just want to say one more thing about the DNA piece. It is interesting for people to find out what their ancestry is and what their DNA is, but I don't want us to forget that what your internal DNA says doesn't necessarily predict how you're going to be treated. You can have that 1/3 sub-Saharan African DNA, but if you present quote unquote white in this culture, you're going to have certain advantages in the job market, be treated better by cops and teachers. And so we don't want folks to get so carried away with these new discoveries of, oh, look, I'm sort of a person of color. Yeah, but if you present white, you're not having a person of color experience. By the same token, you can present black or brown and have 1/3 Northern European, and still the police don't really know or care, and neither do the teachers, neither do the employers or the bank loan officers. So I want us to remember race and racism is about how you're perceived and how you're treated, not what some test at Ancestry.com tells you that you are.
I have to leave it there. I wish I could go on. A fascinating discussion. Rashad Robinson, Tim Wise, Susan Goldberg, thanks to all of you.
Thank you.
Humans